Hello, everyone, and very warm welcome to the first public talk of October Jam, hosted by Mara. And this is our 17th year, and as some of you may know, the theme for this year's October Jam is repair. And we find that after 16 years of working as a media and arts collective, there are several issues on which we find ourselves sometimes stuck, sometimes not clear, sometimes beset with contradictions. So, we have taken this month to take some keywords that have been preoccupying us in our work, in our personal lives, in our politics, and use this month to deliberate on these keywords. So, like today, every Sunday of October at 6:30, we will be doing talks. And today, one of the most kind of problematic, difficult kind of keywords that we wanted to take today was identity, because as a media and arts collective, uh, identity has been at the front and center of many of the things that we do and many of the things that we think about. Um, and I think all of us in the collective want to um, get some more clarity on identity and how do we engage with the concept, um, because we work a lot on the ground, but nonetheless, there are issues about how we frame what we see on the ground, what we do on the ground. So, before we get into it, let me tell a little bit about myself. My name is Ram, and I'm one of the co founders of Mara. And my background is in media and communications, and my doctoral research was on um, digital infrastructure and how digital infrastructure shapes identity and shapes politics. So, identity questions in my own academic research as well. And as a part of a collective, we've done several projects where identity has been a kind of a central preoccupation. For example, just to give you two random examples, a few years ago, we did a survey on caste based sex work in India. Now, those are two vectors of identity intersecting. That intersection doesn't get talked about much, but those are two different ways in which we can engage with identity. Another project we did is theater making with survivors of sexual violence. Now, there also several aspects of identity comes in, perhaps even embodiment as something that shapes one's identity also comes into place. So anyway, we have been thinking about identity for a long time, and rather than trying to think of that there's this fixed meaning for identity, we thought we could start today's discussion with an exploration of how the meanings and interpretations of identity has changed over the years. As we know that no word in any language can have a fixed meaning. The meaning of any word in any language depends on how people use it and how people understand it, and the collective consensus around how that word is to be used and understood. And when it comes to the word identity, obviously it has a very long history. And I would like to begin today's discussion by just taking us through at least the Western part of the story. In Western philosophy, in Western theory, in Western social science, how has the concept of identity evolved over the years, changed? Evolved not necessarily getting better or anything, it's just how it has shifted and turned and twisted over the years. But before I begin, may I request also my other guest, Dr. Rekha Raj, to briefly introduce herself, and then I will talk. So, Rekha, please a little bit share about yourself, and then I can talk.
Hi everyone. I'm Rekha. I'm from Kerala. Right now, I'm working as a research fellow and program lead at ISST. Institute of Social Science First in Delhi. I have been part of different movement like the Dalit movement and feminist movement, pure movement in Kerala, and I do write about these things regularly. So that's it.
Okay, thanks, Rekha. So, moving on to the kind of intellectual history of identity, intellectual history as in like how the meanings or how the intellectual idea of identity has shifted. The word, the word stems from a Latin word called idem, meaning the same. So, the very earliest kind of evidence in Greek society of how identity was thought of refers primarily to not something that we uh, um, can make of ourselves, but something that we absolutely are from the beginning, as given in nature. So, Greek society had, like, for example, citizens, those who could participate in politics, and then there were artisans, there were slaves, and so on and so forth. So, every person's role was fixed, and that was your identity, what was given to you under the social structure of society. So there also, I think, a similar kind of conception you can think of in the caste system, where it is not identity is something not that we can what we think of ourselves or what we make of ourselves, but what is given to us by a caste system. So that kind of system was also there in Greece, although not in the caste way, but in a slightly different way. But as many of us would know, Dr. Ambedkar has also noted many times that similarly the identity in the caste system is governed by a set of rules and injunctions, which means that there is no space for an individual to reflect, reason, or negotiate. You just have to accept the role that is given to you, and that is a permanent role. So even in the Western story, the story of identity in Greek society starts very much like this. But by the third or fourth century, there's a turn to the inward when Christianity kind of starts becoming more or starts increasing its influence. And then we have important people like Saint Augustine, who starts talking about identity as the moral aspect of oneself, that one has to turn inward. So it's no longer a biological or given fact, about no longer tied to your function in society, whether you're a plebeian or whether you're a noble or you're a slave. It's more about your conscience and your devotion to God. So, under the Christian, by the third or fourth century, under Christian philosophers, identity becomes very closely tied to conscience and morality, and it starts turning inward. So that's a big kind of shift, and that continues until we see in the 16th century with the beginning of Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So in the 16th century, identity starts getting connected to a kind of rationality. We are all familiar with the famous statement of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. So the two aspects of that, I think, is about rationality leading to I am, which is consciousness. So identity is kind of linked to a rational consciousness. The two are interlinked, the two are hyphenated. So there can be no consciousness without rationality. And if you don't have rationality, you cannot achieve consciousness. So this kind of thinking becomes very predominant in Europe, and I think from there it starts getting increasingly divorced from any kind of inward reflection or any kind of moral, but it's from morality it shifts to rationality. And I think we see a whole host of important interventions like John Locke and various other, Stuart Mill and so on, who kind of emphasize that there should be an increased effort on knowing the world, how it works. So there's an increased emphasis on knowledge production, on science and development of science and technology. And the idea is the greater advancement you have in over your mastery of the outside world, the greater your own consciousness will be. The greater the degree of increase in the rationality, the greater the degree of increase in your consciousness. So um, I think that continues. And by the 18th century, there's a very drastic break with what is called the materialist tradition, the most famous of which is Marx, of course. And Marx brings a radical inversion by saying that it's not that the consciousness determines the identity, but rather that the real world, the material conditions determines the consciousness. So rather than kind of individualizing, Marx puts the attention back on identity shaped by how you are in your social relations. So, for example, in his most famous work, in Capital, there's a very famous section called commodity fetishism. So, in capitalist society, you don't produce use value goods, you produce commodities. Now, commodities, uh, there is a way in which capitalist production of commodities takes place, where people mistake the relations between commodities to be the relations between people. The relations between commodities starts replacing or starts taking more value instead of like relations between people. A small example, perhaps. Let's say I'm a watchmaker and one of you is a watch buyer. Now, you will buy the watch, but you will not know who has made it or what kind of labor has gone into it. So, you and I are connected through the commodity of the watch. So, the social relation has been concealed under the commodity relation. So, this is the Marx's point that identity is not a fixed, static given, but identity is constantly transforming depending on which kind of mode of production we are in. So his argument would be that it's not about who we think we are, but under which kind of mode of production we live and relate to others. We don't live in a vacuum, right? We live connected with various kinds of people. Just think of your day from morning to night and the various kinds of things you buy and things you consume that puts you into relations with various kinds of producers who have made those things, but we are not aware of how we are related to them. So, as producers, as consumers, our identity is getting shaped. So, in a kind of communist society, in a kind of feudal society, in a capitalist society, in a socialist society, you get different kinds of identities. So that was kind of a rather radical kind of break from previous modes of thinking about identity or previous ways of understanding identity. And from there onwards, the kind of picture starts to change very rapidly from the 19th and 20th centuries, which is what I'll spend a little bit of time focusing on that bit, because that's the bit which we are all kind of more familiar with. This is rather the prequel, so to speak. So, in the 19th century, we get modernity, industrial revolution, and a lot of anxiety about how we are not really in control. So, psychoanalysis, early 20th century, You get the idea that we are not really in control of who we think we are. Unconscious desires, things that are operate without us being conscious of them, that really shapes who we think we are. So that idea comes in, but also a new study of society which was enabled or required by colonial enterprise, that you had to go and master a society that was across many oceans. So how do you master a society? How do Britishers master India? You can't govern unless you know about them, right? Where the pain points are, where the pressure points are. And not that this is a 19th or 20th century, even like as recently as the Iraq war, the British or the American army used to send anthropologists to Iraq to figure out the Iraqi culture so that the American army can, stabilize its operations there, co-opt the local population and so on. So this kind of academic knowledge production has always kind of had an intimate link with control over a population. So in under that regime, there's a whole host of knowledge production that happens in Western academia that has produced its own kind of understanding of identity. So, just to give you a few major examples, um, in linguistics, um, the idea was that, or in anthropology, linguistics, sociology, there were people in sociology, people like Durkheim, in anthropology, people like Levi Strauss, in linguistics, people like Charles Peirce and Saussure, who was a Swiss linguist, argued that society as a whole runs on some invisible rules, which give the appearance that we can act spontaneously, but actually, even when we think we are acting spontaneously, there are invisible rules that structure how we work. So, in linguistics, how would that work? For example, one would think that in language we can speak spontaneously, whatever words we want to speak, whatever. I mean, we might think we have agency, but the structural linguist would say that every time we speak, the language is defined by some invisible rules, which we call as syntax, grammar, etc. Right? The subject, predicate, this, that, and the other. So, language is governed by this whole set of invisible rules under which we, without realizing, talk obeying the rules of language. Similarly, like anthropologists have noted that in many societies around the world, social relations are governed by, or kinship is governed by certain rules. Endogamy is one such rule. Or in many societies in India, the practice is that, the daughter is given to the brother's son or something like that. There are many such of these invisible rules, or how much gifts can you give and receive for which kind of ceremonies. So, a lot of these kind of invisible rules structure the society, and our identity is closely linked to the structural aspects of the society, structural aspects of the language, structural aspects of the ego, superego, it. That's a structural aspect of our being. So, there's this whole wave of structural thinking that's taking place um, primarily after the Second World War, and that's understandable because I think the two world wars have made academics in general pessimistic about the capacity or the potential of individuals as moral or ethical subjects. And it's much easier to think of identity as structurally constrained. So there's this kind of world post World War II structuralist moment, if you will, that's sweeping Western academia in the 60s. And then the problem with this is that it seems to leave no space for agency. We are already governed by some structures. So while this explains a lot of how power works, how domination works, if that were true, and if only that was the truth, then there would be no resistance, there would be no complications, right? So obviously, a lot of people kind of started rebelling against this to try and think of new frameworks of identity which would not just grant how we are defined by structures, but also how we have our own capacity to act against some of these structures, or at least try to resist it in our own ways. So, talking about this last bit, which is, I think we are still in that moment, in a post structuralist moment, where it's a kind of a balanced take on identity. Partly we are governed by external forces, whether they be economic relations, whether they be cultural kind of rules and impositions, or whether they be like language or other kinds of structures. But at the same time, individuals or groups do have the capacity to negotiate or resist, subvert, reject, and so on and so forth. So, there are a few important theorists of identity in this post structuralist tradition. The proto example of this is, of course, the French theorist Louis Althusser. Now, Althusser's thesis was that subject is produced through state apparatus, and he had a whole range of state apparatuses to give in many famous essays that he has written. Most famously, for example, the school, the church, these kind of institutions, um, the police, and so on. They help us become certain people, right? So that's the kind of idea. And this kind of for example, his very famous example of Althusser is a policeman calling out to someone on the street, "Hey, you!" And when I, for example, if I recognize that call and get, or if I recognize myself in the policeman's call, I have been hailed as a subject, right? But Althusser's problem was that while he was kind of very powerfully explained how this interpellation happens, he often didn't leave space for any way out. But there are a lot of theorists who have used Althusser's insights to show how identity is not just given, but can also be more fluid. So after Althusser, there have been a whole range of theorists such as Foucault, Bourdieu, and also Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams. So there have been these theorists working more recently, Judith Butler, Donna Haraway, and many others, even in the anti-colonial kind of Frantz Fanon, and also, of course, Ambedkar, although Dr. Ambedkar is a little earlier. There's a whole range of people who are thinking about not just the oppressive aspects of identity, but also the emancipatory aspects, and why there is a possibility for an emancipation in identity politics. And this latter part looks at identity as partly composed of the environments we live in, partly composed of the histories that we come from, histories that we find ourselves embedded in, but also in terms of the practices. Identity is not a fixed thing. Identity is composed of practices of identification. When we go watch a film, we identify with the characters on the screen, and that becomes a part of how we identify ourselves on how to be a lover, how to be a mother, how to be a child, and so on and so forth, right? So, there are these practices of identification that actually lead to the creation of an identity, which is a continuous process. In those practices of identification, there are oppressive practices, but there could also be emancipatory practices, which could be anti caste, anti patriarchal, anti heteronormative, and so on and so forth, anti Brahminical, and so on and so forth. But the idea is that it's not that the identity leads to practices, but practices could lead to a change in identity. So it's a very kind of hands-on way of looking at how Identity is always a contested terrain. It's not that it's ever finished. There's always work to be done. There's always kind of potential to undo the power structures that define the identity. Obviously, I mean, I can do a much more expanded history, but I've tried to give a very condensed snapshot. And I'll stop there and request Rekha to now respond. And then after that, we can take questions or see if we both have things to respond to each other. So I'll request Rekha to start, please. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Mara for inviting me for to talk in this October Jam program. And I also would like to thank Ram for giving a structural description of historical and theoretical journey of the term identity. So it makes my job much easier. So I would like to read the thing that I have wrote for the better clarity and for the better communication. Once of all, thank you everyone. So I stand here before you as a Dalit feminist from Kerala, a scholar, activist, and participant in movements that have continuously interrogated the fault lines of caste, gender, sexuality in contemporary India. My intellectual and political formation has emerged at the confluence of intellectual and political formation has emerged at the confluence of Dalit feminist and queer movements that have not only reimagined the justice but also questioned the very foundation of identity, subjectivity, and representation. The category of identity today occupies as a paradoxical place in our public discourses. It is at once a site of liberation and of contestation. In both global and Indian context, identity has become a crucial idiom through which politics is articulated, negotiated, and resisted. Yet we must ask, what does it mean to speak identities today? Is identity merely descriptive or it is constitutive? Is it a static one or continuously in flux? And what is the implication of imaging emancipatory politics? Let me start with some. I know that Ram already has talked about the history, but like I would like to start with to contextualize my talk. The term identity has traversed multiple intellectual traditions. In modern Western thought, it is genealogy. It is tied to Enlightenment notions of the autonomous self, the rational, bounded individual subject. But this very idea was destabilized by critical theories of this 20th century, psychoanalysis, Marxism, post-colonial theory, feminism, and queer studies, all of which reveal the self as fractured, relational, and historically situated. For example, Stuart Hall famously argued that identity is not an essence, but a positioning. Judith Butler proposed that gender is not something we are, but something we do, a performative repetition that sustains social norms. Franz Fanon, in his book Black Skin and White Mask, demonstrated that identity is not simply self recognition, but a psychic terrain mediated through the gaze of the power, a space where desire and domination intertwine. In India, B.R. Ambedkar, Jyotiba Phule, and Periyar profoundly reconfigured the question of identity by locating it in the grammar of the caste. They revealed the caste does not merely stratify social relations, it structures epistemology itself, determining who can speak, who can be heard, who can be human, who can be a knower, and who can be a knowledge. So to think identity in India, therefore, is to think caste. It is to think of the ways in which histories of humiliation, exclusion, resistance sediment into the formation of the subjectivity. At the same time, the queer and sexuality movement in India have radically challenged the heteronormative order of everyday life, culturally, socially, and politically. Drawing on the global queer theory, but rooted in the local, these movements question the assumption that gender and sexuality are static or biologically determined. They have shown that identity can be a strategic tool, flexible, shifting, and contextually negotiated. For example, sex workers movement in India have reclaimed their work as labor, arguing the rights and recognition under frameworks of economic justice, even as they insist that sexual labor is distinct from other forms of labor. Similarly, many transgender individuals resist state imposed identity categories. Some refuse to be labeled as transgender at all, preferring to identify as male or female, thereby subverting the bureaucratic form of recognition. Drawing on Foucault's idea of power as productive, we can see that these acts are not mere refusals. They are counter contexts, forms of self making that challenge states' disciplinary control over bodies and identities. In contemporary Kerala, for instance, ASHA workers, a workforce largely composed of Dalit, Adivasi, and marginalized women, negotiate their identities as both workers of the state and members of the oppressed communities. Their protests have strategically mobilized the identity of state workers to claim right, wages, and dignity. Here, the Nancy Frasers would note, we see the intersection of redistribution of economic justice and recognition identity justice, demonstrating how identity is strategically mobilized in relation to structures of power. Identity as a process, it's always beyond this essentialism. Identity is not a fixed substance, but a historical process, always in making. Produce the intersection of outer world of structures and inner world of emotions, memory, and desire. Stuart Hall described identity as a narrative of becoming rather than being. Similarly, Dalit thinkers and feminists have insisted that identity is not given, it is forged in struggle. It is, as Gayatri Spivak would say, strategic essentialism, a temporary collective mobilization that allows marginalized groups to enter political discourses on their own terms, even as they remain aware of its limitations. But another critical question arises here is identity is fixed to an individual, or can it be multiple, shifting, or context driven? Can one choose or use identity according to the context? For instance, can a Dalit woman speak as a woman or as a worker or as a Christian depending on the situation? Theoretically, this aligns with Nira Yuval Davil's concept of transversal politics, where identities are abundant but dialogically negotiated. Individuals move across identity positions without losing the recognition of structural inequalities. Identity then is not a single label but a web of intersecting affiliations, gendered, caste marked, regional, religious, each activated strategically within the specific field of power. I would go now for the how the Dalit as a political subjectivity is constructed in India. So let us move specifically to the category of Dalit. Etymologically, Dalit means broken, crushed, and scattered, but politically, it signifies a radical resignification of brokenness, turning a condition of oppression into a site of resistance. K. Satyanarayana, for example, notes that the term Dalit emerged as a critique of older designations such as Harijan, scheduled castes, which depoliticized the oppressed within the Hindu moral or state orders. The Dalit Panthers in 1973 manifesto redefined Dalit identity as an umbrella for structurally oppressed people, workers, peasants, Adivasis, poor, neo-Buddhist, etc. Later, when Dalit Panthers fragmented into two groups, some groups identified Dalit as something that is related to the historically caste oppressed group. So the idea about Dalit identity also has changed due to the time. Thus, Dalit identity is not merely a social marker, but a project of subjective reconstitution. It rejects victimhood and inaugurates a new political self grounded in fraternity and collective assertion. In this context, we could think about Ambedkar's idea of compassion, Maitri, how he understands a social power relationship and how he imagined a society which is based on Maitri. Uh, Dalit discourses thus embodies a counter epistemology, what Anibal Conjano might call a decolonial turn into that identity, rewriting the history from below and reclaim the right to define knowledge, morality, and beauty on one's own terms. I would say something about Dalit feminism and intersectionality. Within the broader formation, Dalit women have transformed the both Dalit and feminist thought. Early Dalit movements often centered male experiences, while mainstream feminism, shaped by upper caste women, universalized gender while erasing the caste. Then Dalit women entered these spaces during 1990s as outsider within, revealing the caste and gender are not two parallel hierarchies but interlocking systems. They articulate the politics of intersectionality long before the term gained academic currency. Each of For them, intersectionality is not an abstract analytical grid, but an embodied ontology, a way of living, surviving, resisting simultaneously on multiple fronts. Their interventions in literature, activism, dismantled both upper caste universalism and Dalit male hegemony, insisting that liberation must be intersectional in practice, not merely in theory. Dalit women as an identity also open up a space for multiplicity in within, shaped by religion, sexuality, region, and labor. In this sense, Dalit feminism echoes Chandra Mohanty's call for feminism without borders. Attentive to the difference, but rooted in solidarity. It recognizes that structures of power overlap to create unique experience of oppression that cannot be reduced in a single axis. I would end my talk talking about my own experience as a Dalit feminist in Kerala. In Kerala, often celebrated as a model of social reform and equality. Yet beneath this progressive narrative lies an epistemic silence around caste. The dominant Marxist upper caste Christian Nair culture elites produced a public culture that speaks equality while erasing caste from the political vocabulary. K. Sharadamani and Sanyam Kabikad have long pointed out that Kerala's so-called Renaissance was deeply caste-marked. Its modernity, selective and exclusionary. To speak as a Dalit feminist in Kerala is therefore to rupture this silence, to reveal how even progressive movements reproduce Brahmanical notions of purity, hierarchy, and moral respectability. Our task is to reclaim the politics of memory, to archive the invisible histories of Dalit Adivasi Bahujan women who lives have been excluded from Kerala's narrative of modernity. One of the most powerful contributions of Dalit feminism in its insistence is self-representation. Through the autobiographies, poetry, cinema, digital storytelling, Dalit women have created a counter-hegemonic public sphere. These narratives transform personal pain into political theory, reclaiming authorship over their own experiences. This is the radical act of epistemic disobedience, which I refusal to let upper caste epistemologies define what count as truth of knowledge. So identity thus becomes a practice of theorization, not just testimony, producing counter knowledge that redefines a very grammar of social science in India. So today, identity politics stands at a crossroads. One of the hand marginalized groups have used identity as a powerful language of recognition. On the other, neoliberalism has commodified the identity, turning it into a brand, a spectacle of inclusion without structural change. You could see that nowadays in advertisement, you can see the presence of transgenders, lower caste people, but the structure, they are not touching the structure. but they are just cooperating, like co-opting the idea of some politics, like they're using it in a very watered down manner. So, politics of recognition and the politics of redistribution, our current moment dominated by NGOs, media, and diversity discourses, privileges recognition at the expense of redistribution. Representation without justice, visibility without change, that are the hallmark of neoliberal multiculturalism. The challenge, therefore, is to reclaim radical transformative power of identity politics to bring recognition and redistribution into conversation again. To conclude, identity is not a merely sociological category, it is spiritual, ethical, and political horizon. It names both the experience of oppression and the aspiration for freedom. Dalit feminist queer identities reclaim the right to exist differently, to imagine liberation not through the sameness but through transformation. It is also point towards the politics of transversal, as theorized by Yuval Davis and Chandra Mohanty, where multiple identity groups remain in dialogue, forging coalitions without dissolving differences. As a Dalit feminist from Kerala, I understand identity not as a possession, but as a process of becoming, a negotiation between memory, imagination, between pain and possibility. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rekha. There might be some questions from the audience, either offline or online. So we'll wait for a few minutes for that. But in the meanwhile, I had a short kind of uh, response to what you were saying. Um, on the one hand, you were talking about how under neoliberalism, identity has become a brand or a spectacle kind of a politics. But I also notice in the state discourse, not the market discourse, but in the state discourse, there is a kind of a fragmentation or a tendency to fragmentation. Like OBC, EBC, now SC also into Dalit, Mahadalit, and even in Karnataka now there is a big discussion about sub-reservation. So, on the one hand, there is a increasing emphasis on difference uh, under the sub kind of politics, but also it's making it difficult for this kind of solidarity in the Hindi belt. I would say there's a tension between Jat and Jamaat. So the Jamaat is getting weakened by this emphasis on Jat. So, on the one hand, there are these tendencies to consolidate, like Ahinda in Karnataka. In UP election, we saw this PDA formula, or in many other contexts, we have seen Bahujan of the BSP. The Bahujan was a consolidating kind of effort. So there are these contradictory tendencies within the political environment. On the one hand, further sub division, but on the other hand, an effort to politically mobilize around umbrella identities. So I think this is an important tension in the work on identity, and I just wanted to know if you have any thoughts about that, and how do you see this playing out?
So for example, this subdivision, sub observation, that's like a very it's weak. I'm personally against the subdivision of reservations within SC communities, because reservation is something that is it's about representation, political representation. So it's not about which caste is represented. It is about which group are socially represented in the power. So that should be the thing. The other thing is like divide and rule by the state. So everybody wants to, like, there is an strong anti-reservation sentiments here. So actually the state is taking, like, wants to make currency out of it. So that's the thing. In Kerala also it started to think. But if you are, the idea is to get representation demographically. So if you are really going for that, it's very difficult to get representation. For example, in Kerala, we have different castes like Pulaya, Paraya, Parava, different castes are there. And in which Pulayas are the majority. Whereas Parayas coming the second. The third and fourth or fifth or 67th, they are like very, very less number in their community. So if you go by demographically, Pulaya and Paraya will get benefit out of that. So people who are asking for that, they are not thinking about the demographical situation. But if you are going as a group, there are chances to get represented by different so like subcastes within SC. So this is like a, and it's I agree with you that is going to have a tension between the subgroups or subcastes. So in that aspect, would uh, uh, I would think that we need more dialogue. We need more conversation among these marginalized group. So that conversation is not happening right now. So for example, if you think about OBC Dalit alliance, this is also a difficult thing. Dalit Muslim alliance is a difficult thing because it won't come like naturally. You should have some kind of political kind of dialogues, conversations, negotiations should be there. Otherwise, like the Muslims, Bahujans, they are also practicing caste. I have issue with that only Savarnas are practicing caste. Like there is like a impression like that. Only upper caste people are practicing caste. It's not true. Everybody is practicing caste. So how can we arrive at some kind of a common minimum kind of program to address social issues? That would be the thing. And unfortunately, that kind of dialogue is not happening right now.
See, I'll tell you how I'm thinking about it. Like
Mm.
one thing I completely agree with is that reservation is seen as a kind of a welfare scheme, whereas actually it's
Yeah,
not a welfare scheme, right?
yeah,
It was seen as primarily as a representation in society in the key sectors. Like
yeah, yeah.
what like the caste equation is very distorted in judiciary, media, politics, government, bureaucracy. So the idea was to have some kind of representation so it's not entirely dominated. That was the initial idea. Now,
Mm.
like you start mapping demographically, like you said, the majority
Mm.
logic will,
Yeah, yeah.
dictate that the smaller groups will not get any reservation. And the second thing is that I think a lot of this issue on reservation is that many of the groups cannot make it to the point where they can even enjoy the benefit of reservation. So,
Mm.
many groups, for example, if there is no primary schooling, then how will they get to college? Then how will they, be eligible for a government job? Because the reservation starts at the higher levels, right?
Yeah.
The primary education pipeline itself is broken. So, one way of bringing about this kind of graded or addressing the graded inequality is to fix infrastructure, create scholarship schemes, hostels, uh, so that at least the communities who are not getting benefit of reservations can at
Mm.
least start coming up in numbers. Right now, the
Mhm.
existing reservation itself is not getting filled. That's my understanding. In
The
most
issue is
states,
like there should be two kind of approach for this thing. This reservation is something that should be continued like this, and there should be anti-poverty kind of program that should be
mm,
effectively implemented. So it's like that welfare or charity kind of thing should be there. That's the
yeah,
responsibility of government. The thing is like if you really want to uplift those who are poor, you don't need to talk about reservation there. Like there should
yeah,
be proper anti-poverty kind of program. We are not against that. Reservation
yeah,
should be there. Yeah,
yeah,
that's the one thing. The other thing is like reservation is only happening in government sector. What about NGOs? If you are
exactly.
talking about NGOs where we all are working, the representation is like I can say that it's absent. For
Mm,
example, the institution where I am working, I am the first Dalit. When I
Mm.
joined Amnesty, I was the first Dalit woman with more than 20 years of experience in the field and
Mm.
have a doctorate in my hand. So
Mm.
when I have to reach such place, I have to I have to give evidence for my capacity. But if you have just an MA, an upper caste, you belong to an upper caste, you can just walk into any NGO in India. That's it. So
Mm.
and NGOs are the place where you get higher salary. So this is the time now. We also should be reflective about what we are doing.
Yeah.
It's not about governmental issues. It's about how the private sectors are treating caste, and it's
Yeah.
also about the group. They are talking about social upliftment. They are also they are also exclude all this Dalit, Adivasi, even OBC people. So it's like a upper caste hub. You can
Yeah.
just like if you are taking a caste census within the NGOs, then we know it's like we do not need to do that. It's like it's very explicit, but it's
Yeah.
also a time to think about that how we are ensuring representation or inclusivity in our own spaces. That is also very important question.
I mean, now the opposition has started raising reservations in the private sector also as a key demand.
Mm.
So I
Yeah.
hope that will also become a part of the mainstream agenda that, while the liberalization is taking away government jobs, largely
Mm-hmm.
what private jobs. So
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
is a in the non-profit sector, in the academic sector, in the judiciary, in the media, and so on and so forth. So I guess that was what I had to kind of say. I mean, obviously a lot more, but if there are any other questions, let me. I'm just checking for questions. So one question is more on views of identity or as an individual agency and identity as collectively constituted. Particularly in the case of women, there is a denial of the self. She must always exist as a product of community norms or rituals. At the same time, collective assertions, like the Asha workers that Rekha mentioned, also emerge from a collective identification. So, how would you respond to this kind of a tension, particularly in our subcontinent where the notion of individual is contested and these days feeds into a neoliberal discourse very easily? So, what is the potential and challenges of identity as self and identity as a communal or a collective identity?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, of course. The thing is, like, for me, being a complete individual is difficult in a India like society because you are always bearing the burden baggage of your caste, your class, your the gender identity, and all that. So, being a individual with all this liberation and choices is difficult here. If you are an upper caste woman, then you might get some kind of advantages of being in an upper caste. But the sexuality of upper caste women is strictly controlled in India. Sexual choices or like her body is deeply controlled, while the Dalit women's body is kept as a ultimate site of exploitation and oppression. So in a ladder also we could see the differences of your agency or the level of oppression you are facing. So like my first point is like it's difficult to being a free individual here. The second thing is like our life is something that is a constant negotiation and confrontation with everything around us. It can be family, it can be state, it can be the group we belong to, it can be the caste we are in, it can be the social circles we are in. So it's a difficult thing to be negotiate with all this stuff, but we cannot avoid that. For example, if you are talking about Asha, a Dalit women Asha worker is hugely different from an OBC Asha worker or upper caste Asha worker. Their influence in the society or even the influence in the stakeholders they are dealing with, everything is it will be different. But for certain minimum things, you can come along and collectivize together and ask for something. That's like a very innate nature of human. We can collectivize. We can become part of collective because people are like basically human, because social beings as well. So that's why I am saying that collectivizing, talking about your identity, collectivizing, and having conversation with the similar groups and other groups is also very important for a social change. So for these ASHA workers, what we struggle also, we could see that state is against them. Almost all uh, unions are against them, but they are still protesting for their rights. So what here we could do that is like a civil society groups should be like they are all, the only civil society groups are coming and supporting them. So so whenever we are talking about a labor protest or labor struggle, uh, we assume that there will be a support system of left groups, but it is not happening there. So what are the other ways? So there are different kind of social engineering can happen. So that is my hope in the such struggles.
Yeah, and my response is like I think I agree with what Rekha you were saying in earlier, that it's these are both movements that coexist, the individual and the collective,
Yeah,
and they overlap, or maybe not, but often they do. And I think it's a strategic negotiation. Sometimes, the need to reclaim the individual, the luxury of individualism,
yeah,
uh, because of 2000 years of collectivized tyranny of
mm,
caste. So individualism is a luxury that sometimes can be reclaimed whenever possible. But at other times, collective forms of struggle are necessary, or collective umbrella identities are necessary. So I think that's a question of context and what is the need of the hour. And I
yeah,
think people have to kind of,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. There's another question, so we'll.
Hi, Rekha. I'm sitting
I
in my so you guys can all hear me, but it better not jump in my face. I think that what both of you are talking about, uh, while I kind of understand it, I also feel like people that we have interacted with in India are also fighting any kind of identification, right? So, what I'm talking about is two kinds of examples. One is when we look at migrant workers coming to the cities to work. I think it's very interesting how they choose to hide, even though it is somehow inscribed on their bodies. I don't know what you feel about is caste inscribed on our bodies. How do people know who we are, where we come from? How come they are treated so differently when they're out of their own so-called social contexts? So there is an anonymous identity that they carry when they come into the city. And I feel that also allows them to find a space of temporary emancipation, sometimes a temporary kind of release and relief from being connected to a kind of structural violence that they have been running from. And I wonder if how do we then think about this kind of identity in flux, because on at the same time I'm also so on the one hand my question is how do we look at how do we look at what are the identities we need to hide, because definitely one is trying to fight economic struggles back home, but also just making money is crucial. So, in the process of doing that, several groups of people that come to cities are really able to negotiate that because they hide their identities. That's one. And the second thing was connected to this entire idea of memory, Rekha, that you're talking about. Like, we watched a film yesterday where we were thinking about should we remember or should we, or is the burden of memory too much? So we need to keep forgetting. But every time when I hear, especially when I read Dalit feminist writers as well as hear people, we always return to we must reclaim memory, we must kind of. At the same time, I wonder if the identities or in the context of where a person comes from. How does one locate that? Should we think about writing these community histories from where people come and also the identities that they are becoming? Who writes this? Who is the person keeping this memory alive? Is the question I'm kind of pondering with. So I just thought I'll put it out there.
Rekha, you want to respond or should I respond?
You start.
Um, I think it's not a coincidence. Marx was one of the first people to say the subcontinent is has a very toxic kind of this caste kind of medieval kind of beliefs, and capitalism would be very good because it would destroy this caste system, right? So he was quite convinced that steam and railways would be like the main tools to kind of shatter the caste system. Of course, it didn't work as he was expecting, but it is also, I think, the reason why Ambedkar was clear about why villages are a den of ignorance and we should move towards urban, you know, or the urban is the more promising space because it's anonymous, it's a capitalist economy, and like, you're not, the idea is the labor, not really the occupational division of labor is not simply practical in a city. I mean, it works in other more insidious and more devious ways. We know that caste is not absent in the city, but it's not easy to mark a person the way it is working in the rural area. So definitely, when you speak relatively, I think urban spaces there are ways in which at least phenomenology wise caste does kind of get invisibilized a little bit. Although structurally, caste very much remains on the agenda, even in urban. But on the surface, it's difficult. It's not so transparent as it is in the rural area. That is one. And to respond on the second question about memory, I think one of, at least this is my personal view, that one of the problems I think in the anti-caste discourse is that the memory is not only one of oppression, but each caste group has a very kind of rich memory of survival, resilience, talent, skill, because in spite of exclusions, the community has managed to survive, has built up expertise. So there are very rich cultural histories that carry some inspiration of how the survival has happened, how the resilience has built, how the hope has been, seeded. And this was there long before the constitutional ethos was introduced in the country. So figures like, I don't know, like Ravidas or Ayoti Das or, Lalai Singh, there are many, like Jyotiba Phule is a famous one, Buddha is famous, Ambedkar is famous, but there are also like in every state you go, there are these figures who have embodied a kind of an anti-caste ethos, which kind of bring together the spiritual, ethical, all those things that Rekha was talking about with identity is also that. And I think that is where the memory work needs to go, because that is really the life blood or the life world of many groups about which there is not a single word written, or if it is written by an upper caste person, or it is a distorted history. So I think these kind of community histories need to be present as a way of like younger generation to have dignity and pride in who they are and where they come from. So that's what I think about it. So Rekha, if you have something also.
Yeah, yeah. So I do agree with what Ram said. The thing is like the community is not about oppression alone. It's also about pride. It's also about happiness. It's also about community festivals and everything. So it's not that the Dalits or marginalized groups are like they are not crying all the time. They are like they are celebrating their life as well. About the disguised thing, so in Kerala we could see that like more than 2 lakhs disguised Dalit Christians are there because they are claiming us upper caste Christians. So
Yeah.
when this migration happened from southern part to northern part of Kerala during 80s, 70s, and 80s, so many Dalit Christians also have migrated to northern part of Kerala for getting like much better life because of that starvation fear. So they all pretended to be as Syrian Christians there in Malabar because nobody can trace their thing. So even my relatives are also living there as Syrian Christians. So we can say that they are forgetting their identity. But at the same time, if you are claiming your identity, what will happen? You won't get a dignified and decent life. Then so
Yeah.
strategizing as like if you're disguised as something else is also a strategy for survival. So we can't do that. And being Hindu is also like many Dalit groups, Dalit castes are like very, very fastly getting Hinduized
Mm.
because if you get into that thing you have like if I repeat the Kerala case again, the Iravas in Kerala, they were actually tried to get into the Hindu fold. They were the in-between caste. They are not untouchables and they are not the upper caste. So the struggle by Trianaguru was to get entry into the Hindu fold, and
Mm.
they actually succeeded in that. But upper caste people, they couldn't, that touchable caste, they couldn't claim the citizenship or like they couldn't even human status. They didn't get the opportunity to get into that. So these are the different strategies that different groups in India that they are like trying to what I would say trying to get over the caste system.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
I found that is as a strategy for survival.
Yeah. On
Great.
memory, what is
Anything on memory that you want to add, Rekha?
So the thing is like the memory was always about the oppression or exploited things that we have experienced. So there is a tendency to ask about the oppressions or like what are kind of things you have. At the same time, you tend to negate or like tend to exclude the intellectual history of this marginalized group. So in India, all these autobiographical are like they are the bestsellers, but the critical thinking kind of works are not even celebrated or not even read by the people. So what there is like always there is an expectation from us as a victim, like a kind of victimhood narratives. So we are all equally able to create knowledge, theorizing things. So why that is not being accepted as this autobiography? That is the question. So there is a kind of voyeurism from the upper middle class people to view the Dalit lives or Adivasi lives or marginalized lives. The other question is like, who is telling story of whom? So like we were being the objectives of study. We were being the object of study for the last decades, so long decades. So now let us study on ourselves and let us study the other caste also. If I get a grant, I will study of upper caste people in India. I won't go with a questionnaire to any Dalit habitat or Adivasi Uru because I want to study what this upper caste people are thinking about caste, how they are maintaining caste. That I want to explore. It's like it's always like camera is on this marginalized group. It's time to shift the camera.
yeah.
Thank you.
Turn the camera to the cameraman, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, there is a methodological complication because many
Mm,
people will not be ready to like let the gaze in, so to speak.
mm,
These are evolved societies. So I was thinking of like there has been some interesting attempts. Like I remember, I think Sundar Saruka and Gopal Guru had this thing where they were like written a newspaper column and they ask readers to send in their experiences,
Mm.
uh,
Yeah.
or like your beliefs, and then lot of people, unwittingly or happily share their beliefs in the letters, and they collected
Mm.
that. So that could be one. But to do ethnographic work, which is where a lot of the micro practices are really embedded and continue cast in a
Mm.
very devious and subtle
Yeah.
way,
Mm.
that is going to be difficult, even if you get the grant, will you get the access is the question.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So, so that's why Guru said, na, theoretical Brahmins and empirical Sudra. So
Yeah,
like people want so I always had experience like whenever in my late 20s, like early 20s, I started public speeches. So whenever I go for a speech, two questions I will get. One question is like, should we need reservation, uh, we have already think, so that something related to reservation will be there. The next thing, that can you talk about your experience as a Dalit woman? So that the both question I always reject to answer. I usually won't answer to that question, because even if I'm going for talking about rocket science, people will ask me these two questions. So the
yeah,
thing is like, people are like very eager to know about my experience. Like they are not asking about my legacy, who are coming from a Dalit activist family. They are not expecting that. They want me to talk about the oppression that I have faced so far. So that is the issue, because like we are always equating Dalit identity with oppression.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I think theorists like Aloysius is hardly known, even though he's an award-winning, I mean, fantastic
Yeah.
theorist.
Yeah.
So, this is exactly the thing that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think um, if we have no more questions, you have
Yeah,
another question.
I was just also trying to understand like how, especially right now in this whole Hindutva kind of scenario that we are in. I was talking to actually a professor from Savitribai Phule
Mm.
University in Pune, and it was very sad to hear that there are lots of issues in them even running their course, and things are getting a little bit heated up. They want to know what is in the syllabus. There's a lot of intervention by the board, and of course we know that a lot of managements have changed. My question is really connected to something that she was raising, which is like, she's like, we need to rethink the word decolonial, because the right wing has also caught on to it in a very interesting way. So they are also talking about mythologies, they are also talking about community histories, they are also bringing in a kind of mythology, and they are saying enough of this. They are also using the decolonial language, and so there's a particular kind of thing that she was talking about where they are forced to teach this, a particular kind of within the syllabi, where they have to look at who came first or the original inhabitants, and like really digging at Eastern mythology. And I think
Mhm.
it kind of I wonder how one would read something like that. So for all this time, let's say we are hearing about decolonial, let's think about the decolonial lens, but suddenly it's like you also have the right wing, uh, working on the same premise. So how do we then counter these things? Of course, we could do it, but this is happening at a national level, where we will suddenly find new writers, new kinds of mythologies. I just thought I'll ask, how do we, I guess, think about the decolonial, colonial kind of. Like,
Rekha,
can we even use the word decolonial?
thoughts, Rekha?
No, no, I don't believe in any revolution. There is no revolution in Hindu mythology. Mythology. So we can't, like even if we are interpreting, or like we do a textual reading of any Hindu mythology, it will like finally will add to the Hindutva thing. So in Kerala, there is a thing that Ayyappa is born of two, I don't remember, some Krishna or Shiva or some two male gods. So there were in the beginning there were some kind of interpretation as to that is like a very pure history or something. That's
Correct. Yeah.
that's very it's I don't know. It's like it's very danger.
Hmm.
Because Hindu philosophy cannot be liberative. It's based on caste system. It's based on sexism. It cannot be. I don't believe in that kind of interpretation. That's my thing. Because Hindu system is very anti-human and very anti-social in its essence. Like in that sense, I am a true Ambedkarist. I don't know whether I have answered to your
Yeah.
question. I don't know. Yeah.
No, of course, I understand your point of view. I'm just trying to wonder about how these departments will have to contest with what they're trying to teach in gender studies, as opposed to what they're forced to teach as a faculty because of the pressures faced by the management, where
Yeah. Yeah.
they will say things like, what is this decolonial? This is also decolonial. So the kind of meetings that they have itself is quite I mean, revealing of how complex the situation is
So,
at the moment
yeah,
fighting.
yeah, all these fascist or like right wing kind of people, they know they are very clever enough to use all these apparatus to like expand their propaganda. So that's
Ah,
like we could see it's all over the globe. So Hindutva groups also using all these things. Even gender is like it's largely co-opted and use it as like something against the thing. So these are the like we should be very conscious. I don't know like how to be very conscious, but it's like we should be very conscious about this kind of thing because Ambedkar is also Iyengali. Iyengali is co-opted by Hindu group. Like all these Hindu programs, there will be photo of Ambedkar and Iyengali. So they are also, and before that in Ayengali's picture, there won't be this Chandan thing. Now it's like there is a big Chandan Bindi is there. So, and they have started calling him as a Mahatma. So it's like this Hinduization is something that is not like, it's everywhere. It's in your drawing room. It's in your TV. It's your in food habit. Everywhere it's there. So like being like it's a struggle. It's not being a Hindu. That's a struggle.
Yeah,
yeah.
I will. I mean, this question of decolonial, colonial, I would say, is not about British or West. Colonial is about a mode of control, right? So that can be by like the current government, it can be in Hinduism, whatever, in the Vedic kind of structure or vision. So decolonial is that which is against these kind of, uh, you know, control architectures or rules and, vision. So I guess the decolonial, you call it by some other word, it's like Ambedkar said, there is no difference between Buddha and French Revolution.
Yeah.
So now one example from France and one example from the subcontinent, and France was a colonial, country, or Enlightenment is comes from a imperial context. So I don't think it's about origin, where it comes
Yeah.
from, or anything like that. Decolonial is not about territorial boundaries. I think it's more about the ethos and the value system that you can find and build through human contact. So I think that's what academics should be focusing on, not getting caught in this, BJP politics of controlling universities. And that's a battle you can't fight. Or you fight it in court or you fight it in some other way. But the real conversations with students, I think, has to sidestep this whole thing. That's how, at least, I would see it.
Yeah.
I would like to add one more point. Like, for many Dalit scholars or activists, they find colonial modernity as empowering experience because of this all these modern kind of institutions, we got chance to get education, It's good treatment, everything. So colonial modernity is at least liberative for at least Dalits and Adivasis and other marginalized groups in India. So it's like we have a a very strange kind of relationship with coloniality. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We were just discussing this.
So I think this whole kind of nationalism and this colonial as the bad and things here
Mm.
were good. This narrative has to be complicated a bit, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of history which academics can go into to show the concessions that were given by the British, which would never have been granted
Yeah.
and had to be gained before independence, because after independence also it was an elite capture of the state by the
Yeah.
Congress and others. So I think the colonial period, there is lots to dig deeper into that. What kind of negotiations were going on? What kind of logic? The census itself is a very fascinating kind of period, and also the language survey. So there's interesting work done on this, and I think the decolonial or the pressure used in the name of decolonial, we can subvert it using all this material that is there during the colonial archives. Anyway,
Thank you.
I think
There's one more question. One more question.
I think there's one more final question, um, which we'll just I'll there's a question about whether you have read or heard other historical trajectories of identity. Um, Going back to what Ram said about major signposts in Western thought and theory, Enlightenment, structural, postmodern, is this how it is followed in other parts of the world, given that this side of the world was colonized? For example, is that what led to the birth of Orientalism or decolonization as theories of identity? Um, so, yeah, I guess we kind of talked about this in our previous response. So, unless you have anything new to add, I think we did talk about decolonization and all this other stuff. But just to answer this question specifically about whether the pattern of or the understanding of identity followed the same route as it did in the West, I don't think so. It did, because if you look at various philosophical traditions in India, I think they have quite different things to say about what is identity or how do we think of the identity. Not just the Vedic, but even the non Vedic, the Buddhist philosophy, for example. There's interesting work done on Nagarjuna um, and other Buddhist thinkers. There's work on the Jaina tradition on identity. So there's a lot of work on the subcontinent's view of identity, which is not matching the Western story. And some of it comes through in this decolonization, but it's not the material, it's how it's framed. Any interesting material, even if it is interesting, if it is framed for Hindutva, then it loses its
Yeah.
decolonial potential, right? So you can even take Buddhist philosophy and use it to serve a Hindutva agenda. So it's really not the material, but how it is taught and how it is framed. I guess that's really the important part of it, which is where I think people who work with identity, people who teach identity, have to be very careful about this kind of stuff. So that's the only other thing I had to add. So I guess that's that.
Rekha will try.
So thank you so much, Rekha, for this. So I know that YouTube, it will all be recorded. So we'll also share in case people who missed today's live thing can catch up later. And we will try to get people who have worked on other histories of identity, either the Buddhist one or other African, Latin American histories of identity or theorizations of identity. So maybe if there is sufficient interest in the future, we can organize some discussions around that. But meanwhile, thank you all so much for attending this. And thanks once again to Rekha and see you also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, Rekha.
Rekha.
Bye.
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 Bye.